So can you just talk, I mean, in light of the events that we've seen in the last few days, everyone wants to know, okay, if this kind of thing could happen in Calgary and how Calgary Police is prepared?
Well, it would be naive to think that a protest such as what we've seen in Charlottesville could not possibly happen here in Calgary. I think that it certainly could. The challenge is when you get two diverse groups with such entrenched opinions that are prone to becoming unhinged very quickly and digressing into violence, that those events can happen very quickly. However, our goal here with CPS is when we have events, protests, public gatherings that are occurring, our planning process includes a very detailed risk assessment. We're intelligence-led. We work with the protest organizers through our diversity resources section, building relationships, finding out what their objectives are for the protest. And so our desire is to prevent an event like that from turning into a act of violence or a protest of violence like that.
So obviously people are feeling quite emotional after what just transpired. There is a rally, I understand, being planned for Calgary this week. So how do you plan for that and prepare for that?
Well, we're no strangers to planning for protests. We have approximately 600 protests every year in Calgary, and most Calgarians are not even aware of that because they come and go and nothing happens. So it remains fairly transparent to the majority of Calgarians, but we do have approximately 600 a year. And again, our planning process to that is very much intelligence-led. And if a risk assessment for any event gives us an indication that there is a likelihood for violence or a violent clash between the opposing groups, we police that appropriately. We have very highly trained public safety unit officers who have undergone rigorous training. They have the proper skills and equipment to be able to respond to these types of events.
I mean, specifically right now, given we've seen, I mean, for years and years, some of the white power groups in Calgary specifically clash with some of the anti-racist groups. So in light of that, how are you preparing for tomorrow?
Well, again, what we've done is we've looked at the risk assessment for these groups, what their agendas are, and I won't go into all the details of how we do a risk assessment, except to say that it's extremely complex, it's robust, it involves multiple areas of our service coming together for these events, and that information drives how we police it, how we plan, and how we respond to these types of events.
Like, do you look at what happened down there in Charlottesville and say, okay, how can we learn from that so that...
Well, we certainly will learn from that. I mean, that is one of the objectives that we always have in being an intelligence-led police service is how do we learn from this? An example of that is several months ago we had a police commander from Missouri come up and provided a lessons learned on the Ferguson, Missouri situation. So we learned everything that we could from that particular incident. And once the lessons are learned, the reviews are done, the investigations are complete from Charlottesville, my goal is that as an organization we will learn from that event as well.
Is it more of a fluid to try to diffuse one side or the other who may come with the idea to incite violence or anger? Do you have to switch on the fly as you try to diffuse one side or the other, or is it something like you have your starting block and you just go from there and see how it reacts? You don't want to suffocate one side.
Well, there's the delicate balance in policing public protests, like you've said. And that is the challenge. We have what's called both a positive and a supplementary duty to policing public gatherings. The positive response, the positive duty is that we have to ensure public safety. We have to make sure that this event doesn't deteriorate into a violent clash, that people's property doesn't get damaged, that people can safely assemble as their right is under the Charter of Rights and Freedom and express those opinions and values freely. And our supplementary duty is that we don't want the policing response cannot be seen to be oppressive. So we have to walk a fine line, a balanced line between trying to find that sweet spot between an appropriate response, a responsible response, one that's proportionate, and yet not an overbearing police response that could be seen by some to maybe shut down the discourse. And we don't want that to happen as well.
But at what point are you protecting a certain group from themselves, obviously, if it gets heated?
We certainly will, and we've done that before multiple occasions in this city. is the reality is the opinions of some of these groups, the majority of Calgarians find extremely distasteful and unpleasant. And what our job is in those situations is, as a police service, is to protect their right to express that opinion, no matter how distasteful we might find it. They have the right to assemble and express that opinion.
What do you tell your members if you are going up against a group like a white supremacist group or a neo-Nazi group? You have a very diverse force. What do you tell them before they go there and say, look, you know what they're going to say, here's how you get through without getting emotionally affected?
That's a great question, and that's when I mentioned our public safety unit officers, because the reality is we're all human beings. Every one of our fine police officers in this service are exceptional citizens of this city. They're human beings with families, with firmly held opinions and beliefs as well. And so to go into a situation like that, we would be naive to think that they're not impacted at some level to have an emotional response. And that's why our training has to be so robust and so thorough, is because our officers are trained to have the skill to be able to separate their personal opinion from how they might want to react otherwise because of these opinions that are being voiced at these protests, and maintain a professional policing presence to ensure that these people can express their opinion.
So, Inspector, one of the big criticisms, not necessarily criticisms, but big questions out of Charlottesville was the lack of police response on the initial evening protest that occurred with the tiki torches, and how there was almost a real lack of a police presence. So can you just talk about, logistically more so, what's the difference between an event that doesn't have a permit, so it could just kind of happen out of the blue, as opposed to one that you know, like as Nancy was saying, you know it's planned, you know it's going to come, so you have more of an opportunity to get boots on the ground. Can you just kind of go through what that police response can look like when something does happen out of the blue, and you might get, you know, dozens or even perhaps hundreds of people all of a sudden converge, and then you have another counter protest that comes. What does that police response look like logistically?
So for a spontaneous event, I think what your question is, for a spontaneous event that we don't have a lot of time to pre-plan and prepare for, so our public safety unit officers, we have approximately 120 frontline public safety unit officers, but they work, their full-time job is frontline policing. So they're out there, they work in the districts, they're taking calls for service, but they are part-time members of our public safety unit. And so we have had those events happen before, where we've had a spontaneous event occur, something becomes unhinged, and we have to respond. Our incident command structure in the city would be our duty inspector would make a call for response for all on-duty public safety unit members. They carry their equipment with them all the time, and we would have a very agile, very rapid response to the scene of the event wherever that is happening. And the last time that we had an event like that happening, we had approximately 40 public safety unit members on scene in under 12 minutes when we had a spontaneous protest occur. So our response is fairly agile.
Have you noticed any difference in the presence of some of these groups? I'm thinking more on the racist side of the spectrum here. Have you seen a difference in the way that they display publicly, and is that something you guys are tracking at this point?
I wouldn't say it's really a difference. In my opinion, I've been the commanding officer of our public safety unit for a number of years now, approximately 12 years. And we've always had these groups in the city of Calgary. They go through cycles, they come and go. Sometimes they're more visible, more vocal, more bold in their assertions than at other times. And so I don't think this is anything to get alarmed about. This is nothing we haven't seen before. We're well experienced and trained as a service to be able to respond to these types of protests.
Are they becoming more emboldened by what they're seeing in the States, groups like that, like supremacist groups that rely on hate to get a message?
Well, that's certainly our concern, that they will become more emboldened. That's as part of our risk assessment process. That's one of the factors that we're constantly monitoring, is what is the level of aggression, what is the level of hate, how deeply are they attempting to incite violence in other groups, what efforts are they going to countermeasure the police response. All of these things are taken into consideration.
One of the things that some people brought up today in just my interviews were, well, you know, this group doesn't really exist anymore, this group doesn't really exist. And I think that's because we haven't seen them marching on the street. But wouldn't it be kind of naive to think that there aren't the white power groups still active in our city?
It would be
Just because you're not seeing them.
It would be extremely naive to think that, yes.
So can you talk about that and just the presence of some of these groups and just the fact that we're not seeing them doesn't mean they're not active?
Well, they've never gone away. The alt-right or far-right type groups have always been a presence in this city. And again, this is a cyclical thing where at certain periods they seem to have a lot more members and a lot more momentum, traction behind their message, and other times they seem to shrink back for a period of time, and they come and go. But they've always been here. As long as I've been policing in this city, we've had these groups.
Where are we at in the cycle right now, then?
I think it would be fair to say that we're definitely concerned about an increase in the amount of alt-right extreme messaging that is leaning towards that it's all right to use violence to accomplish your goals and your objectives. That does appear to be a trend that we're monitoring, and we are concerned about it, but we're keeping an eye on it.
And I understand that you have to monitor these kind of gatherings, protester and counter-protester, for violence, but there is going to be a difference between them. If you've got, say, like the anti-fascists or whatever, they're probably not really going, there's very low risk, I would imagine, they're going to cross the line into what might qualify as hate speech or another group of crimes such as that, whereas the other group is always going to be flirting with that line by the nature of who they are. Is that something that officers are watching for as well, or is it really, in those situations, or is it really mostly just about keeping the peace?
It's mostly about keeping the peace from our public safety unit officers on the ground response. Our job is, when we're there, our policing presence, the purpose is to facilitate a protest. We actually facilitate both of these groups' ability to express their messages. No matter what their messages are, they have the right to express it. So our job is public safety and facilitating their right to protest. When it comes to hate speech, this is a very complex area of law and one that I am not an expert in. I wouldn't even pretend to understand fully, but we do have experts in CPS in the area of hate speech, and we rely upon their advice consistently during these types of events as to, is this crossing the line into a hate speech type of offense?
And that was my next question. At what point do your guys on the ground say that is essentially, if it's a fluid situation, anything goes? If it's a placard or verbal assaults or anything like that?
I cannot answer that question because, again, that the hate speech is a very complex and rapidly evolving area of law in this country, and I would defer to my service expert in hate speech back there to answer those questions.
Would you guys like us to bring up Constable Craig Collins now, or do you have any last questions for Inspector
I've
Butler?
got a quick question about, we've seen kind of an escalation of weaponry and armory down south. Is there any special approach that you guys take up here? Or any
Is that even
special
legal? Is that like
any
a sign?
regulations up here? Can you bring armor,
Is someone
or
like-
helmets or shields or anything like that to a protest here?
To bring weapons and that to a protest? Well,
Or not even weapons,
Yeah.
just self-defense as something.
Like somebody shows, like you see them showing up in like bike armor or like sports equipment that's meant for other things generally, or someone with shields
Mhm.
and that. Like,
yes.
might not be a weapon, but
So that would be a clear indication to us. So we have occasionally seen that in the past where certain members of a group, and typically what you will find is if you've got a group of, let's say, 100 protesters who are part of a group, there'll be an extremely small number of individuals, extremely small, that may be armored up, that may have their faces masked, that may have backpacks on, that we're concerned may have rocks or other types of weapons in there. And we have measures in place as we're commanding that event that I won't get into to make sure that we monitor those individuals extremely closely and we're extremely tight to them to make sure that we're able to react at the earliest possible indicator of violence.
Good.
Well, I was just gonna ask, are there any lessons already that are clear from Charlottesville, like as far as crowd control or keeping groups separate, that you've been able to observe from what happened there already?
Well, I won't speak specifically about Charlottesville because I think in fairness to my brother and sister officers in Charlottesville, that until a full investigation is conducted to understand exactly how that event played out and how it occurred, it's pretty premature to talk about that. But for example, in the Ferguson riots, when we had the commander come up and talk to us, I mean, one of the fundamental principles, especially as things begin to get heated and crowds begin to become more aggressive with one another, is physical separation between them is absolutely critical. And that's where our public safety unit officers are highly trained to stand their ground. They create lines, physical separation between these two groups, and depending on the amount of threat, we will increase that amount of separation between those groups to reduce the likelihood of violence.
Not very specific in the examples of one group versus another. Is there any difference then in your planning or your execution of plannings for a massive multi-group riot, say the G8 in Toronto or the Vancouver riots, Stanley Cup in 2011? Is there any difference, or is it all sort of one size fits all when it comes to crowd control and public safety?
Same toolbox?
There is no one size fits all. There isn't when it comes to public assemblies, whether they're protests, whether they're celebratory crowds like our Red Mile that we have. The last thing what we would want is a cookie cutter one size fits all police response, because it's the intelligence and the risk assessment that always drives the policing response to these events. The larger the event, for example, when we had Red Mile here, not the most recent one, but the one before that, when the Flames did very well, we relied upon our partners in the RCMP to come and bolster our numbers, not because we were concerned about violence. We actually had a very low concern about violence, about risk, but it's about overall public safety. When you get 60,000 people in one confined area, it takes a lot of police officers to ensure their public safety.
Sorry to extend the questioning. Then what's the threshold for CPS before the RCMP comes in? How big would it be?
The threshold for when we would go to external partners is if the strain on the Calgary Police Service, if the event was so large that it would be difficult or not possible for us to maintain policing operations, continuity of operations, frontline policing, then we would reach out to our external partners to come in with resources to assist us.